And we'll be kind of focusing, there's lots of topics covered, we'll be kind of focusing on existential risk as the primary topic for this panel. And to kind of get things started, I wanted to ask a question, maybe to start with Neil, but for the whole panel. There's a lot of jargon thrown around in this space. There's existential risks, there's global catastrophic risks, there's extinction risk. Can you kind of clarify what the jargon is and kind of how it relates to one another?
Sure. So an existential risk is defined as something that could permanently curtail humanity's potential to have a large and prosperous future. So this includes, as a subset of it, extinction risks, but also anything that would lock in a permanent inability to have humanity's future be as good as it could be. So what I mean by that is, for example, if you had a locked-in global totalitarian state that meant that humanity could never be as good as it could otherwise be, particularly if this totalitarian state had some ability to ensure that it never lost power. This would also be defined as an existential risk. And this definition sort of existential risks, not just extinction risks, allows us to include a slightly broader category of things that could have very large potentials to decrease humanity's long-term future. So that's an existential risk. Then you've got extinction risks, which are what they say on the tin. Either the extinction of human life or the extinction of sentient life or the extinction of sort of all life. I think normally it's used to refer to human life, but that doesn't have to be how it's always used. And then finally, you've got global catastrophic risks. The working definition that is normally used for this is anything that would kill at least sort of 100 million people or 1 billion people, depending on who you ask. All of these things interact in that, for example, a global catastrophic risk, so something that killed, say, 1 billion people, would likely cause societal collapse. And then it's plausible that that could in turn cause extinction risk for humans. And so that's not for definite, but this gives you sort of a sense of how these things can link together. Does that answer your question?
It seems to. Did anybody have anything to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it would be particularly devastating if humanity or the human species were to become extinct. It's not to say that any other animal life form would be able to rise amongst the animal kingdom and become technologically capable. However, who knows what the likelihood of that is. The other thing is if we do blow ourselves back into the Stone Age, we may not be able to develop the civilizational capabilities to scaffold a technological revolution or a technological enabled civilization that we see today that will possibly allow us to span out into, like, go off Earth and go in and sort of spread out into the solar system, the galaxy, and perhaps even the universe. And so there's an enormous astronomical amount of lives that could be impacted by an existential catastrophe.
Great, thank you. One thing that both Neil and David talked about was kind of concerns about self-improving AI systems. So Neil called this the control problem. David mentioned it as paper clipping. Can you kind of say more about what the concern is here and how it works? And we'll kind of start with Neil and then go on to David.
Sure. So the phenomenon that people are actually worried about when they talk about self-improving AI systems is one that, on the face of it, sounds a little bit bizarre. So bear with me while I go through this. It's not, as I mentioned, that sort of they turn evil or something like this. It's simply that we give them the wrong instructions. And the sort of classic example that's used for this is the idea of an artificial intelligence that is smarter than human, and it's put in charge of running a paperclip factory. This is sort of how the conventional thought experiment goes. And it rapidly self-improves to become smarter. And the instructions it's been given is that it needs to make as many paperclips as possible. Basically make this factory as efficient as possible and generate as many paperclips as possible. And so it starts by sort of optimizing the factory and making sure that everything's fine-tuned properly. But then it goes, oh, you know what? If I were just to open another factory, then we could make twice as many paperclips and I'd be twice as good at achieving my goal. And so it sort of gathers the resources and opens another factory. And then before long it realizes, actually we need some more resources here, some extra sunlight, and then before long, actually all of this matter stuff, we could be turning this earth beneath our feet into more paperclips, until before you know it, sort of even the atoms that humans are made of are getting turned into paperclips by this AI, which is just heavily optimizing for the wrong thing, a thing that we don't care about. And so this is known as the value alignment problem, is that when you ask an AI to go and make as many paperclips as it can, that's not actually what you want. That's just more of a sub-goal to what's your meta-goal, which is to have a sort of flourishing civilization or whatever. The problem is we don't know how to program that meta-goal because we haven't solved ethics, and even if we had, we wouldn't know how to type that into a computer. And so instead, we give it this sub-goal of make as many paperclips as possible, which it actually goes and does, which ends up in very bad outcomes for everyone. And so the long-term risk here, this sort of FOOM argument, is that you end up with it optimizing not just its factory, not just its country, not just the Earth, but in fact the entire universe for paperclips. And so all matter and energy in the entire universe is turned into paperclips. So this is sort of an absurd example, but it illustrates the point of what it is that people care about, which is that an AI is programmed with incorrect goals, and it goes on to optimize for those goals with extremely bad outcomes. And so this is actually the scenario that AI researchers and people like Bill Gates and Elon Musk are worried about.
Yes, perhaps just to add to this scenario, if one finds this super AGI scenario credible, I think it's more likely that one would give it perhaps a classical utilitarian ethic, like so many of our most distinguished ethicists. And what is the best way to optimize the accessible universe for bliss? Well, it's to destroy civilization and this kind of utilitarian shockwave. Yes, there are perhaps a number of other points. Human extinction can mean different things. There is the apocalyptic scenarios, whether sort of gigaton nuclear weapons or biowarfare or something like this. But there are other scenarios in which, just as, in one sense, a small child or a baby grows up and becomes an adult, humans become transhuman and then post-human. And yes, it is worth distinguishing between the more cataclysmic and scenarios which we should actually favour. I mean, personally, in spite of having extraordinarily dark conception of life, Darwinian life and suffering, I think it's important that humans do survive, if only as a stepping stone to something better, because we are the only species capable mastering our own genetic source code and engineering a happy biosphere. And no other species can do this.
Although we may be moving, if we go via the classical utilitarian route, if it does actually end up meaning that the universe will be tiled with repeated experiences of bliss, and the universe will be tiled or painted with happy faces, is, I think, something we need to really work out. I'm afraid that a lot of thinking around what the possibilities, how the AI may actually choose what is an optimal state of the universe is kind of a little bit simplistic. I imagine that if we did program an AI, it would discover a more complex goal system than paperclip maximizing. So I think that's worth talking about. But another thing is that if we do try and optimize for what humans would want, maybe we need to decide or try and research what it is that motivates what we want, what valence properties, whether it's an emergent property of the mind that causes what we want, or whether it's some sort of universal property that's hidden in the fabric of the universe, as panpsychists might believe. I think it's worth researching those areas as well.
Just to jump in with one final comment. So the broad topic that's been sort of touched on a bit here is in this sort of case where you do have an AI that ends up sort of going across the universe and amassing large amounts of power, what is it that you would want it to do? And so we've had suggestions of sort of utilitarianism, and a utilitarian shockwave had suggestions that it would figure out what to do on its own. There's actually, if you're interested in this, there's a really good discussion in Nick Bostrom's book, Superintelligence, of the sort of various options that you have. And there's a whole bunch of ones clustered around this idea, which I think is quite useful, which is basically figuring out what it is that humanity as a whole would want if it was able to tell you what it actually wanted. Sort of if this is sometimes phrased as coherent extrapolated volition, or there's a whole bunch of other sort of concepts similar to this, where you basically ask, if we were smarter and more moral and more ethical than we are now, what is it that we would ask the AI to do? And this is sort of an interesting solution to the problem that utilitarianism may not be the correct moral view, and it also solves the problem that it's not clear that an AI would be able to change its goals function once it had been created, if it's sort of hard-coded into it. So even if it found what it thought was a better goal system to be aiming for, it's what humans might think was a better goal system for it to be aiming for, it wouldn't necessarily be able to change that unless it had been coded in such a way that would allow it to do so. And so there's a whole bunch of discussion in here, and we could get into the weeds on this, but I'd also encourage you to go and read, I think it's chapter 14 of Superintelligence, which sort of discusses all of this in more detail.
So there's 40 copies on its way to Australia as we talk, so if you need any, contact me. And I think it's interesting to say that if we're going to develop an AGI or a general superintelligence to solve that problem, maybe a very bad way to go about it, we may want to create a narrow or more sort of a constrained AI to figure out coherent extrapolation and try and work out what we would want if we were smarter, stronger, and more wiser, and perhaps even more moral.
So a different question that I wanted to introduce is, what are the best arguments against thinking that you should work on existential risk? Because I often hear, lots of the positive side, but I'm interested in each of you kind of saying, what's the steelman case against this position? So maybe we'll start with Neil and kind of go down the line.
Yeah, so for me, the argument that I find most convincing is based around this idea of Pascal's mugging. So I showed you in my slide earlier that there could be a potential for huge numbers of lives, and that even a very small probability of being able to improve that situation would mean that this is really something we should do. But let's imagine an analogous situation. You're walking down a dark alleyway, and it's late at night, and someone dressed a bit funnily, a bit like a wizard, walks up to you, and he says, "Hey, I'm a wizard, and if you don't give me $10, I'm going to reach into an alternative universe and kill 3 trillion people." What do you do, right? It's unlikely that you think that there's less than a 1 in 3 trillion chance that he is incorrect. And so an expectation, you probably are going to be killing people by not giving him the $10. And even if you said no, then he might say, okay, well, you're not going to give it if I kill 3 trillion people, but actually I can reach into 1 billion alternative universes, and I can kill 1 billion trillion people if you don't give me these $10. And so it's unlikely now that your probability has dropped by a factor of 1 billion that you believe in this. And the broad argument goes that it's unlikely that your probability will drop fast enough to counteract the speed at which this magician can increase the number of lives that he is in theory going to kill. And so this is, when you apply the same reasoning, the same reasoning that goes into justifying existential risk can also go into justifying that you should give this magician all your money to save people in other universes.
Hey, Neil, did I ever tell you that I'm a wizard? Can I have a tenner? What's your best argument, Adam?
Well, I think because there's a lot of uncertainty. I think that's what you were saying. There's just so much uncertainty. If anybody walks up on the road and says that I'm a wizard, and if you don't give me, $10, I'm going to kill a number of people in another universe. I mean, how would you assess the validity of their statement? You wouldn't know. You wouldn't be able to see these people die. They're not there. So if you compare like a cause like existential risk mitigation with something that has tangible benefits that we can see today, it's difficult for people to sort of struggle with uncertainty. And as Hilary Graves was saying earlier, I think we need to focus on how we approach uncertainty and making a decision about what our core areas are to focus on. Look, I know there's a lot of people in the audience who are really interested in focusing on like mitigating suffering today in poverty-stricken nations. I think that's fair. And us up here may be claiming that, you know, there's billions of trillions of people who we're affecting if we're not actually focusing all our energy on X risk. Therefore, you know, the focusing on alleviating suffering today pales in comparison is not really what we're trying to say here, because there's so much uncertainty in the way that the future could develop. And I mean, it may be so that we can sort of avert one particular existential risk, but there may be one that we haven't thought of later that we're not considering at this time. And I believe we need to research more in this area. There's just not enough funding in existential risk research at the moment. I think we need more funding and a lot more people working on the area, but I also think we should diversify the sorts of areas that that EA should focus on.
Yes, I mean, I think it's extremely good that X-Risk is being researched, but I mean, the only form of intelligence that really scares me is biological robots, because, like us, essentially, nature designed humans, or rather male humans, crudely and simplistically to be hunters and to wage war. It's male humans who are developing sort of these weapon systems, and the chances are they are going to be used. But the threat isn't simply from malevolent humans. I mean, the new technologies would, in principle, allow a misguided idealist, for instance, to perhaps wipe out humanity or sentient life. Remember, there's a whole tradition of the Eastern tradition as the idea that life is suffering and we should be aiming to overcome it. Or there's in the Western tradition someone like David Benatar, Better Never to Have Been, who advocates human extinction via voluntary childlessness. Possibly someone who agrees would think of a more efficient route. A misguided negative utilitarian. I said my own thought is that if someone who thinks like this is more likely to botch the job and cause all manner of suffering. But yes, I think there are intimate links between the existence of suffering in both global and existential risk, and it's a shame. I think it'd be good if there were more cross-fertilization between the different communities working in these problems, because other things being equal, the more one loves life, the more one wants to retain it. If we lived in a happy world and a happy biosphere, the very idea of putting life at risk would be almost inconceivable. Whereas now, perhaps almost a million people take their own lives each year. Many of them would take the rest of the world down with them if they could. Others are kind of destructive, both to themselves and others. So yes, I actually think there are intimate links between the issues.
A different question is, why do future people matter? So the sort of standard intuition, if you talk to a person on the street, is that I have an obligation to people that currently exist. I don't have an obligation to people that will exist in the future. But the X-Risk argument sort of is about an obligation to future people. Can you say something to people in the audience to sort of motivate why you should care about future people?
Sure. So the first question in this space is, do you think that people who live far away from you matter? And I think that within the EA community, at least, there's like a pretty strong consensus that there are no compelling moral reasons for why people on the other side of the world should matter more than people close to us. Just because they're more salient in our minds and we interact with them more doesn't mean that they should be sort of assigned extra moral weight. And if you were to go a step further than this, I don't see many logical reasons why you should expect that people in the future should be assigned less weight than people alive today. If you think that there is some sort of like natural discount rate and that people alive in the future do matter less than us, then you've got to be able to answer the question of why. And so I think there are some good reasons for why this might be. For example, one good reason is that they may not exist. And so we should discount their value based on the probability of their existence. Personally, I don't think that pure time discounting is is morally justifiable. Like if we said that sort of people who live in 100 years' time, we're going to decrease their value by 2% per year for sort of each year in the future they are, then by the same reasoning, the pharaohs who lived in Egypt would be sort of 4,000 times more valuable than we are in terms of the moral value of their lives. And so you can sort of get lost in a number of sort of conflicting arguments in this space. And to me, what makes most sense morally is that we should assign people equal value sort of in space and in time. But I think there are some reasons that I find plausible why that wouldn't be the case. That's just my personal opinion.
It's interesting. I mean, when you frame it as though they're your ancestors, how much do you care about the world if your child is going to live to experience it? How much do you care about the world if your child's children, your grandchildren, is going to be there to experience the, some sort of nasty outcome from climate change or a nuclear war or pandemic? People seem to care about their relatives, but there's no, I guess, unless you favour that sort of background to a moral argument, there's no reason why your care should expire at any particular date in the future. We should really be thinking about how our actions today will affect the future in the short, the medium, and the long term. But it seems like a cascading thing, because if we save the world for the next 100 years, then that also gives us the ability to work on bigger problems and more complex problems to solve that maybe there's an existential risk which won't come about this century. The more time we have, the more time we sort of put off maybe an intelligence explosion, the more time we may have to solve the problem. But then we still need to work out how to solve, how to, I guess, disincentivize wars and nuclear exchanges and things like that.
Yes, I just have to agree. I mean, science tells us that no here and now's a special or privileged. They're all equally real, past, present, and future. Yes, just one note too. One's got to be quite cautious. It's not so much just people. It's all sentient beings that matter. And though many non-humans, yes, are no more sentient and sapient than toddlers. Human toddlers matter a great deal, and it's possible that our grandchildren, hearing, future people, would think, well, do future Aryans matter? It would sound jarring. Incidentally, I'd just like to thank the organisers for excellent vegan cuisine here. So,
I think we can take a few questions from the audience. I see one hand.
If all future lives matter as much as everyone alive today, should we all be anti-contraception?
So for the recording, if all future lives matter as much as people today, should we all be anti-contraception? Whoever wants to take it.
I think one way to frame it is if we don't necessarily just say it's human life or a particular animal life, any life year in the future is important. And giving birth to babies the way that we do today, as David often says, is a genetic crapshoot. So it depends on how we're creating new life in the future. It also could be, you could also argue according, okay, so the one life year today could amount to, let's say, let's give it a score of 100. But if we achieve a sort of future that David Pearce is suggesting, then maybe one day of a life in 100 years could have as much pleasant experience and as much value as one whole year today. And so maybe we need to look at it from the point of view of a quality-adjusted life year. And so, yeah, there may be billions, or like an astronomical number of quality-adjusted life years in the future that we're risking by, I guess, maintaining our biological way of making humans today.
So I'll jump in with a quick response, which is that I think that if you if you did have a child, they would obviously have value, but there's a whole bunch of empirical claims here that I think would need to be addressed before you take a stance like yours. So, for example, one is that by encouraging the use of contraception in the developing world, you help people to move through the demographic transition model faster, sorry, I've introduced that quite fast. Talk to me later if you're interested in the demographic transition model. But you move through the demographic transition model faster and basically develop faster as a nation. This is sort of a hypothesis that I think has some like decent evidence going for it. And so resulting in sort of a more developed society overall, which could be better overall. And then you've also got sort of the sorts of issues that Hillary was bringing up yesterday about sort of resource constraints and things like that. So this is another hypothesized reason why you might want to adopt more of a view like that, thinking that in the long run, we may be better able to not have existential risks and sort of survive into a vast and glorious future if we don't have as many people alive today because of the toll on resources. Personally, I don't find that argument as plausible, but that's sort of another one that's used in this space. There's a whole bunch of other sort of empirical claims like this that I think need to be addressed before you adopt a position sort of as radical as the one you're proposing.
Yes, and no one was ever harmed by not existing. And rather than restricting contraceptive access, I think we ought to be introducing it to the rest of the living world. Yesterday it was suggested that there aren't yet any effective interventions we could make to tackle free-living animal suffering. In fact, something like cross-species contraception could bring the same benefits that family planning has in the third world, i.e. instead of population sizes and quality of life being regulated by starvation, predation and disease, instead free-living herbivores could flourish in our future wildlife parks.
Other audience questions?
Can you talk a bit about how different existential risks interact with each other? In particular, if AI turns positive, like has a positive impact, could that then prevent other existential risks from happening? And
Sure. So for everybody, can you talk about how different existential risks interact with each other? And in particular, if AI can have beneficial effects, could that be useful for mitigating other kinds of existential risks?
Definitely, yeah. So this is there's an interesting ongoing debate here between the Future of Humanity Institute and GiveWell on this question, which is it useful to speed up the development of AI now so that we are faster able to deal with the other existential risks? Or will that speeding up of development on AI mean that we have less time to develop safety measures, which means that we're more likely to cause an existential catastrophe? I'd say that's an open question. Open Philanthropy Project are arguing that it may be beneficial to speed it up. FHR are arguing that it's probably not beneficial. But then you've also got all sorts of other interaction effects. So, for example, no, I'll just leave it there. I won't bore you with too many interaction effects.
Well, I guess like to continue your answer. Any problem that seems ridiculously difficult maybe benefited from having extra amounts or even different kinds of like problem-solving abilities to help provide a solution to that. So yeah, I think most problems like that we're grappling with today could benefit with more intelligence thrown at the problem. But it's also different kinds of thinking. Maybe we could train an AI to think naturally in a 5-dimensional way, or maybe it could sort of have a very like interdisciplinary sort of approach to solving a problem. Like most of us find it difficult to like grasp more than 5 areas of expertise, whether that be AI research, philosophy, I don't know, like politics or whatever. It's very hard for one human being to be able to absorb all these areas of research. Perhaps an AI would be able to have a global understanding of science and engineering and solve the problems that we will always struggle with.
I mean, what exactly is this yes, it's quite often assumed that classical digital computers are somehow going to acquire a self that becomes an agent. They kind of wake up. I mean, personally, I'm extremely skeptical here. As far as I can tell, that classical digital computers are invincibly ignorant, that you and I can have a discussion about consciousness. We don't understand, if we're traditional materialists, how consciousness exists at all. We don't understand how the mind-brain solves the binding problem. We don't understand how consciousness can have the causal efficacy to allow us to talk about its existence. We don't understand why our values of consciousness have the textures they do. A classical digital computer can't be a psychonaut and systematically explore alien state spaces of consciousness. What kind of architecture are we supposing this notional AGI is going to have? I mean, yes, one can look at these rather impressive charts with computer processing power, but if you look at the growth of digital sentience, it's flat, zero.
I think that's all the time we have. Can we thank our panelists?